I think this is on. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. As Philip said, I am from New York City like Jerome, but I am not going to sit in anyone's lap. Promise. But yeah, a few applause for that. But I want to talk about, today I'm going to talk about the rise of platforms and what that means for publishers. A little bit about myself. I've been covering this industry as a journalist for the last 15 years, and to see the rise of platforms is one of the incredible stories of our time. About 4.5 years ago, I went over to Digiday, which at the time was an events company, and the idea was to actually build a media company on top of an events company, and it was going to be on the premise, the big story that we were going to tell is this incredible shift from the analog era to the digital era. And we like to say that, you know, every company, if they're a brand, if they're an agency, if they're a publisher, somewhere along that continuum of point A and they need to move to point B. And the thing that makes it really fun to cover and fun to actually exist in, because we are also a publisher trying to figure this out, is that point B keeps moving. So right when you maybe figure out, you know, your display advertising strategy, you have to all of a sudden come up with some sort of native strategy. Right when you figure out your desktop strategy, you have to figure out mobile. And I think one of the big challenges when we look at publishers today is how they relate to these gigantic platforms. Because platforms present both an opportunity and a threat, honestly. And when we're talking about platforms, I think it's good just to quickly set like what exactly we're talking about. Because we look at the media world at Digiday like very simple. I mean, there's brands and agencies on one side, and there are publishers on the other side. And you know, that is sort of how it's been for a long time. What's different in digital media is the rise of platforms. And these are companies that create software that connect people with, it could be search results, it could be photos, it could be videos, it could be each other in the case of Facebook. And it can be all of those things in what we're seeing in the rise of this new class of platforms. And the difference here is that these platforms, and I think the challenge of them is that they operate with media business models. So they usually sell advertising. So that makes them a competitor to publishers in many ways. And because platforms are built on technology, they have an advantage. They're more scalable. They don't have to hire people to create content. They get other people to create the content for them. And that's led to a depressed ad market because there's more ad space out there than there is demand for it. So the prices go down, and so what happens is it becomes a cost game. And for publishers, they've really, really suffered because they've had to compete with platforms. It's a lot cheaper, and it's a lot more efficient to reach people on Facebook than it is through publishers. But at the same time, these platforms, starting with Google and then moving to Facebook, and we heard about Pinterest. I read a lot of it, so I think I understood what exactly Jan was talking about, is that they have driven tremendous amount of traffic to publishers. So on the one hand, publishers are competing with platforms and not doing a very good job of it. On the other hand, they're dependent on platforms for their traffic. And so that leads to a very interesting both opportunity and challenge. So one of the first big trends that I want to talk about is just how big of an opportunity this is. You know, and I think we all know the numbers. You know, Facebook's now over 1.4 billion users. Instagram is over 300 million. I think Snapchat now is at 100 million, which is smaller, but 71% of them are under 21. I mean, this is exactly where the millennials are. And so this is a very, very, very big opportunity. What we're seeing, though, with platforms, and this is also part of the opportunity, is they're moving from their traditional role of sending people away from them, and they're kind of going back to the future. Because the internet used to be about portals, about MSN, about AOL, about Yahoo. And you know, portals in essence, I remember Terry Semel, the CEO of Yahoo, describing their strategy as being an amusement park. We want to get people into the park, and then we want to have them go to an attraction, and then see another attraction, and another attraction, and next thing you know, they've spent the whole day in the park. Because his background was at Disney in theme parks. And so Google came along and they said, no, 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 that's the wrong model. The model is going to be to actually send people away from Google. And so Google, being a search engine, did just that, and they found an incredible way to make money off that through search advertising. So what we're seeing now with platforms is we're seeing that platforms are shifting away from this model of sending people away to wanting to keep people on their platform. And content is a great way of doing that. And they're now providing opportunities for both distribution and monetization for publishers. A few examples. Snapchat earlier this year started Snapchat Discover. Snapchat Discover is a part of Snapchat. There's like this sort of, the part where Jerome is posting all of his stuff, but Discover is where media companies can also put their content to be discovered. This gives them access to a very, very hard to reach audience at a very, very large scale. And they can make money off it. They can include their own advertising and keep 100% of it. Great deal on its face. I'm going to get to the catch later. Facebook, just the other week, took the wraps off Instant Articles. Instant Articles allows publishers to publish directly onto Facebook and also to keep all of the money off of ads they sell on there, or to use Facebook's own ad system and keep 70%. Another great deal. And then earlier this week, Apple announced a news app, which is a lot like Flipboard, but that's going to allow all publishers to publish their content directly on an app that's going to be delivered on hundreds of millions of phones. So what they're bringing to the table with all of these things is incredible distribution. Distribution that publishers could not get on their own. And they're offering great monetization deals. 100% if you sell the ads. 70% if you use Apple or Facebook's ad systems. So these are really, really, really good. And this is why this is a big opportunity. It's because people are using a lot of these platforms to find news. This is just one part of publishing, but they're using it to find news. And for publishers, this is an attractive audience that they're not reaching through their own properties. So that's the good part. The bad part is platforms are about engagement on their platforms. As I said, they're moving from sending people out, which they're doing a lot of. You're seeing publishers rely on Facebook for 20, 30, 40, in some new cases, 75% of their traffic. But now they're saying, we want to keep that traffic on our platform. And the reason that they're doing that, they'll say, Silicon Valley, I love Silicon Valley as an American. I think it's wonderful, and every country should have one. But they're full of shit a lot. And what they say is, they say this is just about the user experience and everything like this, but it's really about their business interests. And their business interests are to keep people on their platforms to show them advertising. They don't really care how that's done. If that's done through baby photos, great. If that's done through games, okay. If that's done through different applications, no problem. And if that's done through journalism, all right, why not? But at the end of the day, that's what it is about for them. It is about keeping people on those platforms. And so they're basically going to be using publishers in order to do that, which is okay as long as interests are aligned. But what happens when interests do not become aligned? And I think that's the scary part for publishers. Right now, Facebook, Snapchat, they're offering, and Apple, they're offering incredible deals to publishers on their face. But they have a history of pulling the rug out from partners when it serves their interests. So, small example, when we talk about platforms, sometimes we think this is all new. You got to go back to Google, and Google is the first real platform with its search engine. There was an entire class of publisher that was built up on the basis of SEO and optimizing for different searches. Demand media had an unbelievable amount of sites, basically just premised on search keywords. So you would literally search on anything, even like how to boil water. There's a surprising number of people who apparently turn to Google to figure out how to boil water. And if you did, you would get a result from demand media, and demand media was making actually a lot of money off this. Well, Google just changed their algorithm, and it eviscerated the company. Facebook for a while was finding that games was a very effective way for them to keep people on their platform. Zynga became a very large company on the basis of games like Farmville. Pretty soon, Facebook decided that those games were annoying to users and spammy. And Facebook basically just cut them off from their users. And I think the lesson of this is it's never good to rent. It's always better to own. So when publishers are thinking about platforms, they have to be very realistic about this, and I think marketers too, because you're not owning your audience. You're renting Facebook's audience, and at the end of the day, Facebook is going to do what's in Facebook's interests. And Facebook has a history of screwing up when it comes to publishers. Right now they have instant articles, and everyone is going crazy about them, but they already tried this with Facebook Editions, and that went nowhere. It failed. Apple, same way. I mean, Apple now has this news app, but they used to have this newsstand that was just shoving publishers buried into this other app, and it hurt publishers' growth on mobile. So I think it's instructive to look at one of the cases of the power of platforms when it comes to publishers and the downside. This chart shows you Upworthy. Does anyone know Upworthy? It's a site that was purported to be, 2 years ago, the fastest growing publisher ever. And you see the trend back in 2013. And they basically optimized everything for Facebook. And they used what we like to call clickbait. It was like, you won't believe what happened next. And they would get tons of distribution through Facebook. And then Facebook decided users aren't into that. And now that line's going in one direction and not a good direction. So I think whenever we're talking about publishers and platforms, it's good to keep that in mind, because when you rely on someone else, when you rent and you don't own, you're losing control of a lot of your destiny. The other thing that I'm seeing with platforms is that mobile is truly eating the world. There used to be a joke a couple of years ago. We used to always say that it was the year of mobile for the 8th straight year. But then all of a sudden it became true that mobile was truly becoming the way that people were accessing their content. This is both good news and bad news for publishers. The good news is they're doing, despite the challenges, they're doing pretty well at mobile. The New York Times, for instance, now has 50% of their traffic from mobile. And this is pretty common among a lot of publishers. And so that's good. The bad part is the New York Times makes less than 10% of its revenue from mobile. There is a big gap between the time spent on mobile and the money spent. And what's worse is that 8% of budgets in mobile, it's all going to Facebook and Google. It's not going to publishers. Most of the publishers that I talk to say that they can't fill their mobile ad space. And they can show fewer ads on mobile. So this is going to lead to even more dependence on platforms, because the only platforms that have shown, or the only ad sellers that have shown that they can make a lot of money off mobile are Google, but to a greater extent, Facebook. And Facebook in particular has a huge advantage because there are no cookies in mobile, and they have a unique identifier in that everyone is logged on to Facebook in the world, and so they can pinpoint advertising in a way that nearly all publishers cannot. So that's going to lead to more dependence on platforms. The other sort of major trend that I think that actually Jerome sort of touched on this is that platforms require bespoke content. One of the things when dealing with platforms that I think a lot of publishers and with where platforms are going now that they're moving from just shoving people off platforms to keeping them on is that requires publishers to create content uniquely for the platform. And this makes it quite a bit harder to do. But the things that work best on Facebook are made for Facebook. The things that work best on Instagram are made for Instagram. One example I would turn to is there's this company called Now This News, and if you don't know them, do look them up. They're a very interesting experiment in that they don't actually have a website. They only distribute through their content through Facebook, through Instagram, through Snapchat. They recently had 200 million video views. Now, a lot of that is on Facebook. And what's interesting, I think, about Now This is that they are creating video differently for all of these platforms. For example, on Facebook, Now This News videos, because Facebook autoplays videos without sound, they don't require any volume. They actually tell the story by almost like a slideshow part of a video. And so I think more and more we're going to see people, publishers, need to create different versions for different platforms. And this is particularly true in mobile, because mobile is not made for, is not good for desktop content. We had the editor-in-chief of Quartz on our podcast recently, and he talked about the tyranny of the 800-word article. And it's a relic of newspapers that got translated over to desktop and is now being done in mobile. So every publisher is just focused on how to show their content on mobile, but they're not thinking about the format that content takes. And it's something we were thinking about actually at Digiday a lot, because I was like, these articles are too long in mobile. So this is like a typical article we wrote. This ended up coming in at about like 800 words, maybe it was like 750 words. And what we decided to do was, and this was mostly for mobile, but it does work on desktop, is we made this TLDR button. And if you don't know, TLDR is an internet term popular in Reddit, and it means too long, didn't read. And so it's sort of the one-line summary of a long-winded post. So we decided to adopt TLDR as an option on our site. Now, we're going to turn this on as default in mobile. When you hit TLDR, this is it on mobile. It shrinks the article down to 70 words. So all the reporters, and they loved me for doing this, have to write two versions of their story. They have to write their normal desktop version, and then they have to write a TLDR version. And the reason we did this was because what you're seeing with the mobile platform is the content that is made for a mobile device, like Snapchat, like Twitter and stuff like this, does so much better than desktop content. If you're waiting for a train, you're more likely to quickly scroll through these quick summaries of articles. So that's something that we need to think about. And the last point, and this is also something that Jerome very indirectly touched on, was that monetization on platforms is going to be indirect. You know, I think a lot of the challenges that publishers, particularly traditional publishers, have had when it comes to all this disruption going on is that they've tried to view their current situations in the future through the lens of what worked in the past. And what worked in the past was a lot of what I call direct monetization schemes. It was very straightforward. I look at being a publisher the way like being a band is these days. Being a band used to be fairly straightforward. You know, you played a lot, you got some notoriety, you signed with a label, and then you went into the studio, you cut an album or a CD, you sold it to your fans, you went on tour, maybe you wrecked a hotel room, and then you just like repeated the process. Whereas nowadays, to be a band, you have to tour constantly. You have to have a merchandising strategy. You have to have deals with brands. You have to license your images everywhere. And being publishers is a lot about that. It's about indirect monetization. So when Jerome was talking about not wanting to just put ads on his Snapchat feed, what he's talking about was he didn't want to do direct monetization. The normal media approach is you've got a huge audience, just put ads on there. And what he's saying is that there is an opportunity to use that large audience, but to use the influence in other ways. A good example of this is what BuzzFeed is doing. BuzzFeed has really thrived in a platform world because their monetization model is not display advertising. So what they're sort of doing, and I think it's really interesting, is they're building up enormous audiences on these platforms. They're building up a huge audience on YouTube, and they're not relying on advertising on YouTube to make money. Instead, they're using that large aggregated audience in order to introduce sponsored content to people. And it's somewhat, I mean, it's related, but it's really a different way of looking at how to make money off platforms. Because too often, I think people just go to, okay, well, we could just monetize the way we've always monetized before, which is put ads up. And sometimes that's going to be the case, but a lot of times that's not going to be the case. So I think in conclusion, I would say when it comes to platforms, I think all publishers and marketers, because this is happening in marketing too. I think Pinterest showed they're gonna when they show that like buy button and stuff like this, that's like, oh, that's really cool. That's also really dangerous, right? So if you're a retailer, you're looking at that and you're saying, wait, do I get all that data? Do you take that data? Because platforms, Pinterest's not the only one. Facebook's gonna do it. Instagram is gonna do it. Google is already doing it. They're putting these buy buttons everywhere, and they're trying to, just like platforms are keeping publishers on their platform, they're going to keep the commerce on their platform. And that presents the same array of challenges in that you're allowing these platforms, if you're a retailer, to get between you and your customer. Same way for publishers. So I would just say that for all publishers, the challenge is to take advantage of the distribution capabilities and the new monetization capabilities on these platforms, but at the same time to keep in mind that platforms are not in the business of supporting your business. They're about their interests, and those interests might not align with your interests. And it brought to mind the New York Times innovation report. I don't know if any of you saw it. It was about a year ago, and it talked about how the New York Times is sort of struggling in this age of platforms. And there was a lot of tactical things in there about why they're struggling, about audience development and whatnot. But I think the biggest thing that it came down to for me was, again, they have these internal structures that have been a little bit rigid and haven't allowed them to sort of experiment with these kind of platforms. I'm not saying that they should close down their website and put it all on Facebook, but I think it's pretty encouraging that the New York Times has been out in front with doing Facebook articles and with doing the Apple News app, because at the end of the day, I think for all publishers, they need to experiment with this. They can't just jump in and rely on platforms to save their businesses. But at the same time, they need to be open to new ways of making money. So that's all I have. I want to see if Philip wants to come out. He's on his way.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you. They're branded cards.
Yeah,
I have some for you. I'll give them to you.
Okay, we need them.
Yeah.
Mercer Street in New York.
Yes.
Right in Soho, right?
We are right in Soho.
So you're making money?
We're making money, yes. But we make money through an indirect model a lot. So we do a lot of conferences. We're starting to do them in Europe, but we do about 14 a year, which is amazing. And so our model basically is, we are a media company, so publishing is at our heart. We have 10 journalists who work for us. And we basically are looking to build our influence and a focused audience of those who are obsessed about the future of media and marketing. But the difference is we're sort of agnostic about how we make money off that influence and audience. So we do run display advertising. We have a sponsor content business, but we think we can make money in different ways, and particularly through events. I think, as you see, it's a nice way to make money.
Yeah, for us, it's always very expensive since we have these expensive speakers and chefs, and so we have to find new ways.
The heart doesn't come cheap.
Yeah, exactly. So now, yesterday at the speakers' dinner, we were talking about all these companies that live on Facebook, and you said that you are really doubtful, and that they can persist and that they are there for the long term.
Yeah, I think and it's something I didn't get to really address that much, but one of the big challenges with relying on Facebook is when you live in the news feed, your brand is sort of subsumed. It's just like a headline and a photo, and then it's a little caption that says where your brand is. And ultimately, what publishers need to do is build strong brands. You can make money off of a strong brand a lot of different ways. But the risk of relying on Facebook is that you might get a lot of traffic for now from them, the algorithm, you're being favored by the algorithm, but you might not build a brand. You might just become yet another thing in the news feed. So I think the jury's still out about whether many of these fast growth companies are building true brands. I think BuzzFeed is someone that sort of hit escape velocity. They've now become, while they depend on Facebook, they're diversifying across other platforms, and I feel like they've built a modern brand that is very, very, very strong. And I think that makes it a lot more defensible than someone like Upworthy, which can just go down like that and nobody even notices.
So Upworthy is dying right now?
Well, maybe.
Okay.
Your words.
I'm observing the American publishing and venture capital scene, and I'm surprised that there's so much money being given to publishers. BuzzFeed, Vice, Business Insider, they get so much money. I mean, and then they don't have any monetization, or very small monetization compared to the amounts of money they receive. Yeah. What does that tell you? I mean, why is that in your mind?
It tells me that there's too much money chasing too few ideas. But I think the bets that venture capitalists are making sort of make sense in a venture capital kind of way. Because we're in this age of under-monetized media. So you see people with tremendous audience growth that, if you break down what they're making per user compared to traditional media metrics, it's like 5% of what, a traditional media. Like if Business Insider is 60 million, they're making pennies on that, per user. Whereas if they were a magazine, I mean, they'd be the largest magazine in the world. So I think the bet is that their monetization is going to come up, but it's just a bet that they're going to be able to make money off these enormous audiences that they've been able to amass. I mean, it's kind of I think publishing nowadays is sort of like the Tour de France, during the Lance Armstrong years. People were zooming up Alpe d'Huez, and it was the French said pas de normal. It was just not normal. Okay. So I think that there's a lot of that going on right now. There's a lot of sort of and that's what platforms are leading to, this kind of performance-enhancing drugs effect of audience growth compared to monetization.
But monetization is going to follow, you think? I mean,
is it going to what?
Is it going to follow? Is it going to come at some point?
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily going to come. I think, what a lot of these companies are based on is having a much lower cost model than traditional publications. I mean, they don't talk about that, but Business Insider, they used to show this slide. Henry doesn't show it as much anymore, which was basically that they were going to undercut the Wall Street Journal and higher cost competitors because, yeah, their brand wasn't as strong as, say, the Wall Street Journal and stuff like this, but that in a very, very tough ad market, it's going to come down to who can produce audience most efficiently. And so they have a much lower cost newsroom than the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or any of those kind of publications. So I think, unfortunately, the reality for most traditional publishers in competing with this is that they have to drastically lower their cost base to compete, because it's not like ad rates only go in one direction. It's not up.
Okay.
It's depressing.
I mean, if you would pick 1, 2, or 3 brands that are coming out of this after all, I mean, who do you think is there for the long term? Is Business Insider in there for the long term? Is Vox Media going to survive? Who's going to stay in that game? Yeah, I mean, I think if I were to look at the people, BuzzFeed reached, like I said, escape velocity. I think the media company that to me is most interesting, and they're taking a very traditional approach, is Vice, because in this age of under monetized media assets,
Vice is arguably over-monetized for the size of their audience. Their audience is not enormous, but their brand is extremely strong, and they've taken a very flexible way of making money. They're as much of an advertising agency as they are a publisher. I know at one of our conferences, Kraft was presenting a case study, and they went into some slide about the agencies that help them with it, and there was your regular names of agencies, and then there was Vice on there. And for them, Vice was an agency, because what Vice was able to do because of their brand is they're able to bring a sensibility, but they're also able to bring a production infrastructure. They're actually extremely efficient at doing video production, because they hire a lot of like young people who are really cheap and are willing to work like 11 hours in like a Williamsburg loft. So for someone like Kraft, they're like, yeah, they were way cheaper than like our normal agency partners. So I think that's an interesting one to look at, because Vice is extremely profitable, whereas all of these other companies, like you said, it's a bet that they're going to be able to translate these audiences, these big audiences, into big businesses.
Okay, and do you see like platforms that Vice works on especially well? I mean, I don't see them on Facebook that much. Are they?
Well, that's what I was saying. It's a very traditional. They have a very traditional sort of approach to. It's not about Facebook traffic. It's not about Twitter traffic or any of that kind of stuff. They're relying on cable distribution. They're relying on deals with like HBO. They're very strong on YouTube, but thanks a lot to YouTube promotion and stuff like that. So I think what the lesson for Vice, to me, is you got to build a really strong brand for the long term. Because if you're like Upworthy, you can get big traffic numbers, but without a big brand, you're at someone else's mercy. Vice is not at any distribution partner's mercy. They're not at Facebook's mercy. Facebook could decide to cut off Vice tomorrow, and Vice would be fine. And
how come Vice wasn't among the first partners with instant articles on Facebook? They weren't, right?
No, they weren't. They are on Snapchat Discover.
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe the terms weren't right for them from Facebook.
The last question from me. You talked about this instant article thing. Obviously Digiday is probably too small to be asked that question by Facebook.
I don't know about that, Philip. I'm just kidding.
But if you were in charge at these media companies, does it sound like a good deal to you?
Yeah, for now it's a great deal. I wouldn't close down my website and start, say, hey, we're gonna rely on Facebook for our business, because as I said, the interests of publishers can change, or the interests of platforms can change, and they can diverge from, publishers. Facebook has shown in numerous examples that they will kind of quash partners, people that used to be partners, when it's in their interests. It's sort of like, is Game of Thrones popular here? It's sort of like Game of Thrones. I feel like publishers and marketers are like sort of like just like the regular citizens of Winterfell or like King's Landing, and there's like these like Lannisters versus the Boltons versus the Targaryens going on fighting these battles, and like sometimes they're just like completely killed in the. No one ever talks about the villagers.
So, in other words, you think that the New York Times or all these other publications that are taking part in the instant articles offer, they could be the new Zynga then?
No, because again, I think that they're being like realistic about it. If you look at like, they're not going to publish all of their articles on there. If they did, I would say, well, that's crazy. But like to use it as like a promotion channel, to use it as a way to like, why not? I don't see like a lot of downside as long as the business terms are favorable and it's giving you distribution. But I think they have to be careful, and I think they are being careful, because I think a lot of people have learned from all the people that have gotten squashed by these platforms. Look at YouTube. I think these platforms have learned a lot from YouTube, because YouTube provided incredible distribution to people, but they didn't provide very good monetization. So people have been forced to monetize in a lot of different ways. I know Naomi's going to talk a little bit later, maybe she'll touch on this, is, if you're a YouTube star, you can't rely on like YouTube ads to make money. So I think publishers, I hope, are a little bit smarter about it, having seen, we have enough history, we've seen this movie before. So hopefully they can just experiment, and if good stuff comes out of it, great. But in the end, publishers, like any other business, they have to be self-reliant, and they have to make their own future and not rely on platforms for it.
Okay, are there questions in the audience for Brian? No questions?
Stumped.
I can go on, but you'll be here for the day, right?
Yeah.
You'll be here for the day.
I'll be here.
So you can go and find him. He really knows a lot about publishing in the US and using platforms. Thank you so much for being here and for making the trip. And we'll hang out with you later on throughout the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you.